We're recording. All right. Well, welcome, gentlemen. Thanks so much for joining us tonight. It's so great to be back together again. The last time we were all in the same room was March 3rd, I believe. And these are sort of precarious circumstances, but it's good to be able to see you all together. Thanks for being here.
Pleasure.
So let's get started and let's talk a little bit about the process of Dustbowl. So I'll sort of start. The idea behind Dustbowl began with researching the story and understanding what happened. When I started researching the Dustbowl, first of all, I had never heard of it before. But when I started researching it, it was amazing because it felt like a fairy tale. It felt like something that was totally unreal, something that could never happen in the world, and yet it did in the 30s. And so it was very interesting, and reading more of it and looking at antique newspaper articles and historical documents, I started to think that this would become a really cool major work that could be really effective, especially during our times. So I immediately approached Tony Maglione, who's to my bottom left here, to talk about, to see whether we wanted to do something like this. And Tony, can you continue with the story and just sort of talk about what your first impressions were?
Sure. So Sam came to me with this idea about uh, this work that would have the listeners experience the Dust Bowl, but from primarily firsthand sources, so primary sources, and so I knew immediately that that was going to be a heck of a lot of research. And just sort of in talking about it with my colleague Ron Witzke at Jewel, he said, "Well, I have a connection, and I know a fair amount about this stuff already." So then I went to Ron and I said, "Ron, would you consider helping us compile a libretto? And if so, let me put you in touch with Sam, and let's see if we can get this all to work out." And so we could start compiling a libretto, and then I'll write music based on what you find, and we'll make it a real collaboration.
Ron, can you sort of talk about the process of compiling all of the Dust Bowl text and how you created some of it as well, and your process of sort of compiling it all together?
Sure. Thanks. Yeah, my interest was really piqued when I heard Tony talk about this, and so I mentioned to him that my dad and his family were directly affected. They grew up in the Panhandle of Oklahoma, and so I knew some of the stories vaguely just by talking to my dad and his family and that kind of thing. And then had recently watched the Ken Burns special that kind of piqued my interest even more. And so I had kind of that background already. And then when Tony approached me, I was like, "Hey, I'll help you. I'll go and dig some more, read some more, and research some of the primary sources." So last summer, that was last summer, the beginning of last summer. So I planned a road trip out to my one of my living aunts in Hooker, Oklahoma, and went out there and spent a couple days and visited some of the museums that are in the Panhandle and some of their stash of materials and sources, newspapers, firsthand accounts, diaries, and that sort of thing, and took a lot of pictures and made a lot of notes, and then spent the rest of the summer sort of configuring those in a kind of telling a storyline. And I wrote some original poems too that kind of fit in this narrative. And so 3 or 4 months went by, and finally got a draft together that I felt was some sort of structure that told this story from these personalities that were involved, families, the government, all this kind of thing, and kind of presented it in outline form to Tony just to kind of see what he thought. And then we kind of did back and forth then and kind of refining the story.
Absolutely. And just as a side note, Ron found several different pieces of this that were just absolutely fascinating. Things like Tex Thornton, who believed that he could make it rain by launching TNT into the air. The Rabbit Roundup, which is coincidentally the most happy and joyful and improvisatory song in the entire work, and it speaks about probably the most horrific part of, or one of the most horrific parts of the Dust Bowl. Really, really outstandingly done. I was such a fan, and I think that it made the experience that much more palpable to be able to sing through it and to have our singers read through it and so on and so forth. Good. So we got the text. Ron compiled the text, and then Tony started working on the Dust Bowl. And we're going to get to some of the compositional elements of the Dust Bowl in just a minute. But I just want to skip forward just a little bit and talk about when we had already gotten the piece of music. Bart and I had the initial conversation about what the Dust Bowl would look like. And there were some crazy ideas being thrown out at the time. Things like a sand pit that Bart immediately told me in the moment would never happen because AT&T has never had that before. Yeah, he's shaking his head right now. But what ended up happening. So Bart, can you sort of talk about when you had first seen the Dust Bowl, or when you had first read through it and sort of started to see our rehearsals, what sort of things were you looking at, and what things did you try to accentuate in the performance, and sort of to bring audiences into the story? And yeah.
Well, one of the things that first hit me was sort of this 360-degree world that these people were living in. So rather than making it a set with just one side, I wanted people to live in the world. And the darkness of what it was like when a dust storm came and how people had to view themselves and see each other. I also really enjoyed that. And then when we found out that we were going to be able to have a sand pit because of the national touring company of Once on This Island, who had been at AT&T, we were able to use their sand for our sand. Watching the actors actually and the singers play with the sand really started inspiring me into how we're going to light them and how we were going to create the environment of as hot as it was and as dry as it was and as dusty. There's not really very much pretty lighting in the show. It's more very realistic and hot and dusty. But we did end up getting that 360 degrees with the band on one side and then the audience on the other three sides.
Yeah, it was very fascinating. Because as you can probably, to our listeners, as you can probably tell, you had projections on all three walls, but you also had basically theater in the round and the sand pit in the center. And I will say that, the lighting and the projections, when our singers started to see it, it almost felt like there was a bigger commitment to the music and a bigger commitment to telling the story than what I've seen before. Not that it wasn't, not that the commitment was, bad or anything before, but this just sort of like heightened and sort of even brought the singers into the story that was being told, which you just witnessed. Tony, can you talk a little bit? Go ahead.
I just wanted to throw out that I did not do the projection work on the show. I brought in some professional folks, Cameron and Courtney Ware, who own Lightware Labs. Courtney is a Sundance award-winning filmmaker, and she's the one who actually shot the video you guys saw tonight. But working with Cameron and Courtney, we were able to create that atmosphere that we were able to get with the projections.
Yeah, and it was a very interesting process in terms of figuring that out, because we had to there were 3 people that had to be in the room figuring out, do the projections go with the lighting, and do they go with where the staging is? Does the staging match the projection? Does the staging match the lighting? Does the lighting match, what's going on? And that was something that personally was a really cool and rewarding experience when all was said and done. Truly a collaboration on all fronts here. Tony, can you talk a little bit about the compositional aspects that you put into the Dustbowl that we heard? Namely, one that we spoke about, or that we have a video of that we posted earlier this week, and some of the other things that you sort of composed throughout the work.
Sure. So Ron wrote this fantastic libretto, and the first part tells about what was happening in the country at that point, that the Dustbowl, what was leading up to the Dustbowl. And then the second part is really firsthand accounts. And then the third part is this asking the question, have we done enough as a society that we won't see this kind of thing happen again? And so I really wanted to capture that in several different ways. So for those outer 2 portions, I tried to capture that through minimalism and through a very strident and often dissonant and sparse texture. Even in the choral singing, there's not a whole lot of lush. There's a bunch of just sort of angular dissonances that I built off of just a 3-note cell that I expanded out. The real meat of the composition is in that middle portion where I wanted the sound to warm up. And I think you could hear that as you listened, because then you get your firsthand accounts of, first of all, that's where the poetry, you first hear poetry rather than just news reports. And you get the firsthand account of Caroline Henderson, who's talking about what it was like to clean their houses out after a dust storm, and you get firsthand accounts of what it was like on Black Sunday, and you get the absurdity of Tex Thornton wanting to throw dynamite into the sky to make it rain, and then also kind of the necessity but also the horror of the big jackrabbit kills. So you get these firsthand perspectives in that second portion. So from that, I figured that I wanted to use sounds that the common person would have heard at that point in time in the United States, but not necessarily in the way they would have heard them. So I scored the work for a folk band. So violin, mandolin, guitar, bass, and piano. And then in the outer 2 portions, I distilled those sounds and then put them back together in a very, like I said, angular, dissonant. They're written out like classical notation. So you're going to hear those sounds as if they were just the components of a folk band, but not necessarily in a way that you would have heard a folk band. But in that middle portion, you hear a little bit more strumming, you hear a little bit more improvisation, you hear a little bit more chord progressions that you might be more familiar with and associate more readily with folk music. In addition, I think what you were talking about before, one of the things I did was during the Black Sunday movement, there's this vocalese that starts low in the singer's register and goes high in the singer's register while the projections are just spinning. It looks like wind just spinning around. And that was to emulate an actual siren that would have been in use in the 1920s, a warning siren. It's a Sterling Model M. So what I did was I took the fundamental and then the overtone series and put them in the voices and allowed them to make the siren sound itself. And it really adds what I think is a spark of sort of terror to that movement and the reality of what it would have looked like seeing hundreds of feet of dust in the air coming at you at full force.
Absolutely. Ron, let's talk a little bit about your poetry. you know, we sort of kind of explored the Jackrabbits earlier this week. Let's talk about the final movement. Can you talk a little bit more about your vision of what that poetry was about and sort of your thinking behind it?
Sure. That was actually the last piece that I wrote, because I was trying to figure out a way to end this thing that was that left a searching, a wondering, a conviction, and then ultimately an accusation from those who were there, looking ahead to the future and saying, what about the next generation? So in that last section, which is the prophecy, then this poem kind of finishes out the section where I, I I read some in the sacred scriptures. So I read, Revelation, the book of Revelation, the Apocalypse. That's kind of my that was sort of a touchstone for me, just to imagine what, and relatedly, the folks that went through the Dust Bowl, many of them were deeply devout folks who wondered aloud whether or not God was punishing us for our sins, and this catastrophe was his wrath being poured out on us because we were a sinful nation. So that kind of played into my thinking too, as I wrote this half dream, half prophecy stanzas, where I wanted to evoke this end of time kind of feeling, which is what they felt. Many of them thought this was the end of the world. What are we going to do? And so that's kind of where the genesis of it came from. And then finally kind of ending with this accusation by future generations. And of course, there's a lot of that going on now with Greta Thunberg and her climate crusade to wake us all up to what are we doing? What have we left for this future generations? So I end with those haunting lines that, what have you done? You're the ones who've, you meaning us, we now have done this to the earth, and what are we left with? It's an accusation that's terrifying, but hopefully can serve in a way to wake us all up and saying, look, it's time to do something about this. And it's a terrifying feeling. And Tony just, he outdid himself. That music is so incredible, just really, really piercing, and leaves that sense of, okay, it's up to us now. What are we going to do about this? So that's basically the genesis and the kind of thinking that I was trying to evoke in that poem.
Well, and speaking of relevancy, let's just talk about the fact that literally not a week and a half after the performance, when everything gets shut down, the opening scene of Dust Bowl is a bunch of our singers coming out and coughing. Very, very interesting and super unexpected, but just a little relevancy point. I want to ask this of everybody here, but I want to start with Bart. Is the project, the way that it ended up, the way that you thought it would end up, or did it take on a completely new life for you?
Well, for me, being a designer, I would say it took on a completely different life when you added Cameron and Courtney's projections to the work that I did. The music and the lyrics, I don't do a lot of choral work, but I don't look at this piece as a choral work. I look at this piece as a theatrical, a theatrical piece that's collaborated on with your singers. And I now have friends and stuff that I would have never had before had I not been part of the process. And I look forward to what Verdigris will do in the future, because Bart is not the stand and sing kind of choir go-to guy, but if I'm an audience member going to see a choral work that looks like the Dust Bowl, wow, let's go every single night, because it was an amazing opportunity. And friends in my family who came had no idea what they were getting themselves into, and are still remarking and talking about how great the music was, the words were, and the way that the whole piece went together.
Tony.
Yeah, I that's a good question, Sam. And I have to say, I agree with Bart. I don't think I ever want to see this piece without the projections, without the staging, without the sand. Uh, I just think it's it, you know it's an oratorio essentially, right? So it has choral work, it has solos, but I I didn't know I was writing a theater piece. I thought I was writing a sort of not a park and bark, because I know you do more interesting stuff than that, but I had no idea that it would be so um, I felt so invested the whole time I was watching it. It wasn't just because I wrote it, it was because like the staging was great. The projections were phenomenal. The libretto really worked, and it told a story the whole way through. And your singers, they were just outstanding, and they acted and they sang and they worked really hard the whole way through. And the band played well. I mean, it was the whole piece of art just came together in a way that I just didn't expect.
Ron.
Yeah, I mean, I sort of come from that from the theatrical background myself, and done some opera singing. So but I didn't compose it as an opera, and I had never really written a libretto, but I just tried to tell a story, and then I left it to Tony, and then the rest of the folks, the production team and the choir. I mean, they brought it to life, and it ended up being an oratorio that was acted out. And to me, that was fascinating and thrilling to watch, because I didn't know what was going to happen with it. I knew there were going to be some projections, but seeing everybody sort of do their movements and interact with each other. I mean, to me, that's the kind of theater I like anyway, and that I'm sort of used to. So I was really impressed, and it kind of went way beyond what I thought it was going to be, and turned into this this Gesamtkunstwerk, of a production that I think, as Bart said, it speaks to people in a way that just when you stand there and sing, it doesn't. And we sort of got a taste of that at the church, on the last night. It was kind of it was beautifully sung, and they acted it out, but it just wasn't quite the same. And I think the singers felt that, and the audience, of course, they had no idea what they were missing because they hadn't been to the others, and they loved it. But nonetheless, if we could have had everything, the sand, the projections, the lighting, that would have been amazing for them as well.
Absolutely agreed. For our
Sam,
audience, go ahead.
What did you answer that question as the director?
Sure. Definitely did not come out thinking, or coming in, I didn't think that we would be what we were coming out. I'm the type of person that I love to dream big, and I love to have a vision, and I love to say crazy things like, let's have a sand pit in the middle. But I don't actually expect half the time that those things are going to happen, because you aim high and you land somewhere in the middle, and then there are those little tiny bits, those little tiny bits in time where, like, the thing that you ask for actually gets granted. And in this case, in the Dustbowl, it was exactly that sand pit. I have to say that musically speaking, I expected nothing less. Tony, I have known Tony since I was a high schooler. He was one of my first choir directors. So I knew that going into this, that Tony was going to do a really fantastic job. I didn't really, what we got out obviously was something that I'd never heard Tony compose. And I think he would agree with me that this work really stretches us all, in the sense, musically. And then, of course, like, in terms of the staging and in terms of the projection, like, you can't really know what's going to happen in the space until it actually happens in the space. So, we had planned, and I had met with Courtney and Lightwear Labs and with Bart previously to talk about what colors we wanted, what type of staging we were looking at, what projection I really was looking for. But it didn't really come all together until like the week of the performance when we were able to see everything. And I think that was really powerful. I think it definitely exceeded what I imagined in the first place. And I think that speaks to the type of collaboration this was. It was really, really something that was done together. And I think we can all agree that everyone was sort of pushed, Tony on the musical side, Ron on the text side to really like bring out the story, and Bart on the lighting and set design part, to just make this something that was going to be really cohesive and really, really spectacular. And I think that for us as an organization, this really did push the envelope. So let me go back to this. What I meant to, before I ask my final question, just a few insights for the audience. Tony talked a little bit about the Sterling Model M siren. So the is exactly the pitches. He set those pitches from an actual Model M siren. And if you take a look at our video from earlier this week, you can actually hear Sterling Model M siren on the video, or you can look it up on YouTube. It's pretty easy to find. Some other tidbits for you. Rabbit Roundup, as we mentioned in the beginning, is one of the most free pieces in the entire work. It has improvisation. It has lots of movement from the singers, lots of improvisatory talking, lots of singing. It's the most folky of all of the pieces, or one of the most folky, and it talks about probably the most tragic part, or one of the most tragic parts of the Dust Bowl. You'll also notice that the work is laid out in a way that you'll see in the program that we've attached. There are 3 parts to this. And the parts are actually very similar to Handel's Messiah. So the oratorio was actually modeled somewhat with the idea of Messiah in mind. Is that correct, Tony?
Yeah, it was, yes. Yes is the answer, I guess, in that it was tripart. Yeah.
Got it. Yeah. So my final question to everybody here is this. What was your most favorite part of witnessing and being a part of the Dust Bowl? And for me, let me just say very quickly, one of the most meaningful parts for me was actually on the night that we performed it without any staging in Fort Worth, because there was a moment in Rabbit Roundup, and I had told the choir, I was like, you don't have to do the movements, you don't have to do all of the staging. This is more of a, we're just going to sing through it and we'll move a little bit, but it doesn't have to be anything more. But during the performance, during Rabbit Roundup, the choir members actually felt empowered and free enough. They knew the music so well that they actually started making up their own choreography as we went along, and it worked very well. There were choir members do-si-doing each other and sort of doing it in the style of what we saw in the staging, and that was probably one of the most meaningful moments to me as a director, because there's nothing more gratifying to someone like me than to see the ensemble that you're sort of facilitating to be so comfortable and so open that they feel safe enough to be able to improvise. So that was probably one of the most rewarding things for me. Let's start with Bart.
Oh, well, I knew you were going to start with me. Mine is actually going to be musically. And forgive me because I don't know the name of the song. But Christina's solo when she's I think it's in the third movement, when she just sat on stage on a milk stool and just sang her life out. Every single time she sang that song, tears welled up in my eyes. And it's actually happening right now. That particular song, the lyrics, the music, all together, it had nothing to do with the theatricality. It was just this beautiful lady sitting there just singing about her life, and the way that she acted it and sang it, absolutely, by far, the best thing ever.
I agree. And one of the other things that happened during that solo was the projections that just destroyed me emotionally, of those kids in the 1930s. Just so powerful.
Yeah, I had to not look at those, because I would just be a blubbering idiot if I looked at the projections. So I just focused on her, and I still cried every night.
Well, I even remember us all sitting there and looking at the projections, like as we were rehearsing, and being like, I can't look at this. I can't look at this. I'm going to start crying if I do. Yeah, it was very meaningful. She did a very good job. Ron.
Sure. I mean, related to that, I just appreciated the way every soloist kind of took on their part and made it really distinct. And, because that's what you hope for when you do dramatic work. It's a characterization. And so I think the whole structure provided them with the freedom to do that. Because sometimes when you stand and sing, and a normal oratorio, you are characters in a way, but you don't have the freedom that you have in something like this. So I sort of I agree with what Bart said. It's like when they sang their role, it really came out, and it was really, really genuine, heartfelt, and they connected with it in a way that was just spectacular. Every time they did it, they found something new too. You could see them evolve in the piece every night we did it, from dress rehearsal all the way through Sunday night. It's like you said, Sam, they just kind of freed up, and they took on that character. And I'm thrilled to hear him do it again. It's just great fun.
Tony.
Yeah, there were so many things. For me, I guess hearing the piece work from beginning to end was a big part of it for me, and watching the way the singers took to it, both the singers and the band, to be honest with you, the way the whole group artistically took to it. And it's always humbling when you put notes on a piece of paper and then people take it seriously, so it seems like such a small thing, but it's not, because being a conductor myself, I look at a lot of scores, and some speak to me and some don't, and some, I'm just like, no, that's not right for this group, or others are like, yes, this is what I've been looking for. And so to watch people just sort of embrace what you've spent hours and hours and hours on and love it as much as you do, it's a really cool feeling.
That's awesome. To our audience, we asked the same question. What was your favorite part in the performance? We want to hear from you, and we want to be able to respond to you. So please say something in the comments below. Give us a like, give us a love, give us a comment. We'd love to hear from you and any additional questions that you have. Gentlemen, it's so great to be able to be here with you, and really thankful that we get this time not only to screen the Dustbowl, but to talk about it again. I think I'm not the only one in saying that we hope that the Dustbowl continues, not the event, but the performance. So, and I hope that we can continue to perform it and to give it new life. So thank you all so much for being here. And thank you, audience, for being a part of this screening and watching and tuning in with us tonight. Thank you, everybody. and we'll see you soon.